200 feet above the Iraqi desert, in the absolute black of half past midnight, a Royal Air Force navigator watched the radar altimeter unwind toward numbers that no peacetime instructor would ever have permitted. The aircraft was a Panavia Tornado GR1, a machine built for a war that never came, designed to scream beneath Soviet radar through the murk of the North German plain and crater the runways of Warsaw-packed airfields. It had been conceived for grey skies and pine forests. Now it was hurtling across a moonscape it had never been meant to see, toward an enemy who had been told by his own commanders that the British jet was little more than a toy. A European toy. That was the phrase. Iraqi air defense officers, briefed on the coalition aircraft they would face, reportedly dismissed the Tornado as a quaint NATO contraption. Overcomplicated, over-engineered, the product of three squabbling European governments who could barely agree on a wing shape. Saddam Hussein commanded the fourth largest army on Earth. He had hardened aircraft shelters, layered surface-to-air missile belts, and more anti-aircraft artillery ringing his airfields than the Luftwaffe had ever put over the Ruhr. What could a committee-built jet possibly do against that? By the time the sun rose on January 17, 1991, that question had been answered in fire across a dozen Iraqi air bases. The opening night of Operation Desert Storm, the largest aerial assault since the Second World War, would see coalition aircraft strike target after target in a choreographed avalanche of destruction. And at the very tip of that spear, screaming along at the height of a church steeple, were the men of the Royal Air Force flying the most dangerous mission profile of the entire war. But this is not, in the end, a triumphant story. Not entirely. Because that same first night, and in the desperate days that followed, the Tornado Force would pay a price that shook Whitehall to its foundations. Within hours, a British crew would be hanging beneath their parachutes over enemy soil. Within days, two RAF faces, battered, swollen, hollow-eyed, would appear on Iraqi state television, and through the new and merciless lens of round-the-clock satellite news, they would be beamed into sitting rooms across Britain. The whole country would watch. How did it come to this? How did an aircraft designed to fight the Cold War in Europe end up flying suicidal, low-level attacks across the deserts of Mesopotamia? Why did the RAF choose the single most perilous tactic available, racing in at rooftop height straight down the throat of Iraqi gunners, when the Americans were dropping their ordnance from the relative safety of altitude? And was the cost worth it? The answers reach back through decades of British defence policy, through the agonised calculations of a government that had just changed Prime Minister mid-crisis, through the long shadow of a Cold War that was supposedly ending, and through the cold, professional courage of aircrew who knew, climbing into their cockpits that night, that the odds of coming home were not as comfortable as anyone in London cared to admit. The Iraqis called it a European toy. Over the coming weeks, the Tornado and the men who flew it would force a brutal reassessment. But that reassessment would be written in craters and casualties, in propaganda broadcasts and prisoner exchanges, in the quiet grief of RAF Germany stations whose crews did not return. To understand how a Cold War jet came to be the spearhead of Britain's largest air campaign in a generation, we must first understand where Britain stood as 1990 gave way to 1991, a nation between eras, between wars, and between prime ministers. In the autumn of 1990, Britain was a country caught between two worlds. The Berlin Wall had fallen barely a year earlier. The Soviet threat that had organised every facet of British defence thinking for 4 decades was visibly crumbling. And across Whitehall, officials were already sharpening their pencils for what everyone assumed would be a generous peace dividend. Fewer tanks, fewer squadrons, smaller defense estimates. The Cold War, that long twilight struggle, seemed at last to be ending not with a bang, but with the bureaucratic whimper of a defense review. And then, on August 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein sent his Republican Guard pouring across the border into Kuwait. And the certainties of the post-Cold War dawn dissolved overnight. The timing could scarcely have been more awkward for the British state. The armed forces had spent a generation preparing for one specific war, a Soviet armoured thrust through the Fulda Gap and across the North German plain, to be met by NATO forces dug in around the inner German border. Britain's contribution, the British Army of the Rhine, RAF Germany, the whole vast machinery of forward defence, was configured for Europe, oriented eastward and frankly ill-suited to projecting power into a desert 2,500 miles away. When Lieutenant General Sir Peter de la Billière came to assemble Britain's ground contribution, the 1st Armoured Division, he found it had to be effectively cannibalised, stripped of men and equipment from units across the British Army of the Rhine to make a single deployable formation. The cupboard, in real terms, was nowhere near as full as the Cold War order of battle suggested. There was a political dimension too, and it was extraordinary. Britain's response to the invasion of Kuwait was set in motion by Margaret Thatcher, who happened to be in Aspen, Colorado, alongside President George Bush, when the news broke. Her instinct was characteristically iron. Aggression must not be allowed to pay, and she famously stiffened the president's resolve. This is no time to go wobbly. But Thatcher would not see the war she had helped to summon. By late November 1990, beset by cabinet rebellion over Europe and the poll tax, she was gone, replaced in Downing Street by John Major. Britain thus entered the largest military undertaking since Suez under a prime minister who had held the office for mere weeks. Public opinion was uneasy but broadly supportive. The memory of the Falklands, that improbable, triumphant campaign of 1982, still warmed the national mood, and there was a settled British conviction that naked aggression should be resisted. Yet there was anxiety too, much of it focused on casualties. The Iraqi army was a battle-hardened force, fresh from 8 grinding years of war against Iran. It possessed chemical weapons and had shown a willingness to use them. Whitehall's planners braced for losses on a scale Britain had not contemplated in decades, and the Joint Intelligence Committee fed sober assessments into a cabinet that knew the political cost of body bags coming home on the evening news. For the Royal Air Force, the crisis presented both an opportunity and a profound problem. Here at last was a chance to prove the worth of a force that had spent decades training for an apocalypse that never arrived. But the RAF's premier strike aircraft, the Tornado GR-1, had been built to a very particular specification: to penetrate Soviet defenses at high speed and ultra-low level, beneath the radar, and to deny the enemy his airfields. That was the doctrine. That was the design. And as the squadrons of RAF Germany packed up and flew south toward the Gulf, the great unspoken question hung over every operations room: would a weapon built for the plains of Europe survive in the skies over Iraq? Britain was about to find out. The aircraft at the heart of the story was a curious beast, and its very origins explain the Iraqi jibe. The Panavia Tornado was a child of compromise, a tri-national project between Britain, West Germany, and Italy, hammered out in the 1970s by 3 governments with 3 different requirements and a shared determination to keep their aviation industries alive. It had swing wings that could sweep back for high-speed dashes, sophisticated terrain-following radar that let it hug the contours of the Earth at night and in cloud, and a reputation among its crews as a magnificent, if temperamental, machine. The RAF's strike variant, the GR-1, was optimized for one mission above all others, tearing across enemy territory at 200 feet and 500 odd knots to put Soviet airfields out of action. To do that, British planners had invested in a remarkable and controversial weapon, the hunting JP-233. It was not a bomb so much as a delivery system for systematic devastation. A pair of enormous pods slung beneath the fuselage, each spewing out a torrent of submunitions as the aircraft flashed overhead. Hundreds of cratering charges to break up the runway concrete, and scores of small area denial mines scattered among the craters to maim and kill the repair crews who came to fix them. The catch, and it was a terrible one, was that to deliver the JP-233, the Tornado had to fly straight and level, directly over the target at suicidally low altitude, into the teeth of every gun the enemy could bring to bear. There was no standing off. There was no diving away. You flew down the throat of the airfield, and you hoped. The crews who would fly these missions were largely drawn from RAF Germany, squadrons like 15, based at Laarbruch, men who had spent their careers rehearsing exactly this profile against Warsaw Pact targets. They deployed through the autumn of 1990 to bases ringing Iraq, Muharraq in Bahrain, Dahran in Saudi Arabia, and Tabuk in the kingdom's northwest. 3 wings of Tornado GR-1s, plus a detachment of reconnaissance GR-1As, all under the overall British command of de la Billière, with the air effort woven into the vast American-led coalition campaign plan. Among the crews was Flight Lieutenant John Peters, a pilot of 15 Squadron, and his navigator, Flight Lieutenant John Nichol. Like most of their colleagues, they had joined the RAF, expecting to spend their careers facing the Soviets and to retire without firing a shot in anger. Now they found themselves in the desert, practicing endlessly, mastering the unfamiliar discipline of air-to-air refueling over featureless terrain, and contemplating projected loss rates that nobody wanted to say aloud. As one navigator later recalled, the Iraqi Air Force and Army were a genuinely daunting adversary, and the expected casualties were high enough that many crews privately reckoned the first missions might be their last. On the other side of the line stood Saddam Hussein's Air Force and its defences. And here lies the bitter irony of the European toy. Iraqi airfields were among the most heavily defended targets on the planet. Soviet and Western contractors had built them with deeply buried command bunkers, hardened aircraft shelters of reinforced concrete, and integrated belts of radar-guided missiles and rapid-firing anti-aircraft artillery. Iraqi gunners were confident. They had survived years of Iranian air attacks. They had been told that the coalition's fancy machines could be brought down by a wall of lead thrown up into the night. As the United Nations deadline of January 15, 1991 came and went without an Iraqi withdrawal, both sides knew the waiting was over. In darkened operations rooms across the Gulf, the orders came through. The crews walked to their aircraft, and the JP-233 pods, for the first time in their existence, were made live. The decision that defined the RAF's war was, in essence, a decision about altitude. And it was a decision that would be argued over for years afterward. The coalition's overall plan, masterminded by the Americans, was to dismantle the Iraqi air defense system in the opening hours, then range freely from medium altitude where the anti-aircraft guns could not reach. But on that first night, with the defenses still intact, somebody had to suppress the Iraqi Air Force before it could rise and contest the skies. The most effective way to keep enemy aircraft on the ground was to wreck their runways. and the only weapon in the coalition inventory purpose-built for that task was the British JP-233, which meant the Tornadoes had to go low. Not medium altitude, low. Down on the deck, terrain following radar, driving the aircraft at 200 feet through the dark, then straight and level over the most heavily defended real estate in Iraq, while the pods disgorged their cargo. It was the mission the aircraft had been designed for. It was also, by common consent, the most dangerous flying profile undertaken by any coalition aircraft in the entire campaign. The atmosphere on the British bases in those final hours has been preserved in the testimony of the men who were there. At Dhahran, ground crews loaded the aircraft on their own initiative, slinging JP-233 on some and 1,000-pound bombs on others, then sat and waited for a tasking signal that had not yet arrived. When it came, the detachment commander wanted things kept deliberately low-key. Knowing the aircraft were ready, he simply let a couple of hours pass and told almost no one. And then, for the first time in the weapon's history, the armourers made the JP-233 pods live, a flight sergeant double-checking the settings, then the armourer double-checking, then the aircrew themselves checking a third time because nobody had ever flown one of these things in anger before, and the margin for error was nil. These were professionals at the very edge of their training, doing something no RAF crew had done since the Second World War. Flying into a defended enemy heartland at night, expecting to be shot at by everything the enemy possessed. The projected loss rates had been sobering. Some estimates circulating before the war suggested the Tornado Force might lose aircraft at a rate that, sustained over a long campaign, would be ruinous. Crews wrote letters home to be opened in the event of their deaths. They worked out quietly who would fly which slot in the formation, and they knew that the aircraft at the back of the stream, flying through skies the enemy had already woken up to defend, faced the worst of it. In the early hours of January 17th, 1991, the order finally came. Across the Gulf, on darkened flight lines from Bahrain to Tabuk, the great twin engines spooled up, and the Tornadoes rolled. 4 jets from the Dhahran detachment and 8 from Muharraq formed up among the first RAF aircraft to cross into hostile airspace, each clutching its pair of JP-233 pods, tasked with cratering the runways that kept Saddam's air force alive. They turned north toward the border, dropped down to the deck, and disappeared into the blackness of the Iraqi desert. Behind them, in operations rooms across the coalition and in the joint headquarters in Riyadh, men stared at clocks and maps and waited. In London, it was still the dead of night, but the lights burned in the Ministry of Defence and in Downing Street, where a Prime Minister of barely 7 weeks' standing waited for word. The largest air assault since 1945 was underway, and the Royal Air Force was flying point. The first reports would not be long in coming, and not all of them would be good. To fly a JP-233 attack was to enter a sensory hell that the surviving crew struggled afterwards to describe. Imagine it. You are 200 feet above an enemy desert in pitch darkness, the green glow of the instruments, the only light in the cockpit, the terrain following radar throwing the aircraft up and down over unseen folds of ground at the speed of a rifle bullet. Ahead, the airfield announces itself first as a smudge on the radar, then, as you commit to the run, as a sudden, blooming inferno of tracer fire clawing up into the night. Iraqi anti-aircraft artillery threw up curtains of it, great arcing chains of luminous death, and the crews flew straight into the middle of it because the weapon gave them no choice. Across the Iraqi heartland that first night, RAF Tornadoes struck airfield after airfield. The Tabuk wing mounted a mission against the runways at Al-Assad Air Base in central Iraq. 8 tornadoes, all armed with JP-233, in a formation led by squadron leader Pete Batson and wing commander Mike Heath. As Batson and Heath thundered down the runway, disgorging their submunitions, an Iraqi Mirage F-1 chose that very moment to land directly into their weapon's footprint and was promptly obliterated. Their aircraft was christened MiG Eater for the feat, though the victim had in fact been a French-built Mirage rather than a Soviet MiG. It was a moment of dark, almost absurd good fortune amid the terror. The JP-233 itself was a horror to behold and a marvel of grim engineering. As each tornado swept the length of its target runway, the pods beneath it cracked open and rained down their contents, hundreds of cratering charges to punch through the concrete and heave it skyward, mingled with scores of small area denial mines designed to lie among the wreckage and detonate beneath the feet of repair crews. Runways that had been smooth ribbons of concrete became cratered, mined wastelands. Saddam's airfields, the ones the tornadoes hit, were, for critical hours and days, simply unusable. This was the spearhead of a far larger storm. Above and around the low-flying British jets, the coalition air campaign unfolded on a scale that defied comprehension. American stealth fighters slipping unseen over Baghdad, cruise missiles arriving with uncanny precision, wave upon wave of strike aircraft hitting command centers, missile sites, and airfields across the breadth of Iraq in a single, meticulously synchronized night. Hundreds upon hundreds of targets struck in the opening hours in an assault that dwarfed anything since the bomber fleets of the Second World War. And down at the very bottom of that towering edifice of air power, eyeball to eyeball with the enemy's guns, were the tornado crews of the Royal Air Force. But there was no such thing as a free run through that wall of fire. As the campaign moved from its first night into the daylight raids that followed, the tornado force began to take losses. And one of them would become the most famous British image of the entire war. On a low-level daylight raid against Ar Rumaylah airfield, the tornado flown by John Peters, with John Nichol in the back seat, was struck by a surface-to-air missile and a hail of anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft was mortally hit. The two men had seconds to act. They ejected, the Martin Baker seats firing them clear into the desert sky, and floated down onto enemy soil, alive, but utterly alone in the heart of Iraq. They evaded for a couple of hours. Then Saddam's forces found them. And the European toy that the Iraqis had so casually dismissed had now delivered into their hands 2 of its crew, men who would shortly be made to pay for the audacity of the RAF's campaign in front of the watching cameras of the world. The price the Royal Air Force paid was real, and it was felt acutely back home. In the opening phase of the air war, the Tornado Force suffered the heaviest British losses of the campaign. Aircraft went down, to missiles, to gunfire, to the brutal physics of flying fast and low where a single mistake or a single lucky round meant death. Within the first days, RAF crews had been killed, and others, like Peters and Nichol, had been captured. For a nation that had braced itself for casualties but still flinched at the reality of them, each loss landed hard. It was the capture of Peters and Nichol, though, that seared itself into the British consciousness. And here the Gulf War revealed itself as a genuinely new kind of conflict. This was the first war of the rolling news age, fought live in colour in the nation's sitting rooms. And so, when Iraqi state television broadcast footage of the 2 captured airmen, faces swollen and bruised, eyes hollow, mumbling stilted, clearly coerced statements into the camera. Those images travelled around the planet within hours. They appeared on the front pages of every British newspaper. The two Johns, battered and broken-looking, became instant and unwilling symbols. To Saddam, trophies of defiance. To the British public, evidence of his brutality and a focus for national anxiety and rage in equal measure. What the cameras did not show was the 7 weeks of captivity that followed, the solitary confinement, the interrogations, the systematic abuse the prisoners endured in Baghdad. Peters later spoke with characteristic understatement of being paraded, bruised and battered on Iraqi TV. The full account, when it emerged, was considerably grimmer. These were men who had done their duty, flown their mission, and fallen into the hands of a regime with no regard for the conventions of war. Their ordeal put a human face on a campaign that had, until then, been narrated largely through grainy gun camera footage and the antiseptic language of military briefings. There was a hard military lesson too, and the RAF learned it fast. The low-level JP 233 attacks were devastatingly effective at cratering runways. But the cost in aircraft and crews was unsustainable. Flying straight and level into massed anti-aircraft fire, night after night, was simply too dangerous to continue once the immediate job of suppressing the Iraqi Air Force was done. After the opening days, the RAF abandoned the low-level airfield denial tactic. The Tornado Force climbed to medium altitude, where it was beyond the reach of the guns, and shifted to a different mission entirely. That shift exposed another gap. To bomb accurately from medium altitude, the Tornadoes needed laser designation. And in early 1991, the RAF did not have enough of it. The solution was almost comically British. The aging Buccaneer, a hulking 1960s naval strike aircraft pulled from the back of the hangar, was hurriedly deployed to Bahrain with its pave-spike laser-designating pods to spike targets for the Tornadoes to hit with precision bombs. The first Buccaneer tornado attack came on February 2nd, 1991. It was an improvised fix to a real capability shortfall. A reminder that even a sophisticated modern air force can be caught short by the unexpected demands of a real war. What had Britain lost? Aircraft and the lives of brave men. What had it learned? That the doctrine of a generation, the low-level dash perfected for the plains of Europe, was lethal to those who flew it once the enemy was alert, and that the future of air warfare lay higher up, in precision delivered from beyond the reach of the guns. The European toy had proved its sting. It had also revealed, in blood, the limits of the war it had been built to fight. When the ground war came at the end of February, it lasted barely 100 hours. The Iraqi army, pounded for weeks from the air, broke and fled. Kuwait was liberated, the coalition's political objective achieved, and on February 28, 1991, the guns fell silent. The prisoners came home. John Peters and John Nichol, released in the war's aftermath, returned to a Britain that had watched their ordeal in real time and greeted them as something close to national figures. A status neither man had sought, and both wore uneasily. For the Royal Air Force, the Gulf War was a sobering vindication. The Tornado had done what was asked of it, and the airfield denial mission had helped keep the Iraqi Air Force grounded in the campaign's critical opening phase. Saddam's pilots, far from contesting the skies, eventually flew many of their best aircraft to sanctuary in Iran rather than face the coalition. The European toy had bitten hard, but the deeper lesson was about the future, not the past. The era of the heroic low-level dash was over. Precision-guided weapons delivered from safe altitude were the future, and the RAF emerged from the Gulf determined to invest in exactly that capability. The hurried buccaneer deployment and the laser designation scramble were filed away as expensive lessons that must never be repeated. Strategically, the war reshaped Britain's sense of itself in the new world taking shape after the Cold War. For 4 decades, British defence had been organised around a single contingency: the defence of West Germany against a Soviet assault. The Gulf demonstrated vividly that the threats of the coming era would be expeditionary, that British forces would be called upon to deploy at speed to distant theatres, far from the comfortable infrastructure of NATO Europe. The difficulty de la Billière had faced in scraping together a single armoured division from the British Army of the Rhine was noted in Whitehall, and it fed directly into the defence reviews of the early 1990s as planners began the painful work of reorienting a Cold War military toward a world of regional crises and coalition interventions. The special relationship, too, was burnished. Britain had been the most substantial coalition partner after the United States, and the close cooperation between British and American forces in the air, on the ground, at sea, and in the intelligence sphere deepened the bonds between the two militaries. The pattern set in the Gulf of Britain as Washington's most reliable and capable junior partner in expeditionary war would define British defence policy for 2 decades to come, with consequences that reached all the way to the deserts of Iraq once again in 2003. The seeds of much that followed were sown in the sands of 1991. There was a darker legacy as well. Thousands of veterans would later report a constellation of unexplained illnesses that came to be known as Gulf War syndrome, a controversy that dogged the Ministry of Defence for years, and that has never been fully resolved. And the JP-233 itself, that ingenious and terrible weapon, did not long survive its moment of glory. Its anti-personnel submunitions, small mines scattered across the battlefield, fell foul of the growing international movement against landmines, and Britain would eventually sign the Ottawa Treaty and withdraw the weapon from service. The single most effective tool the RAF brought to the opening night of Desert Storm became, within a few years, a weapon that Britain had pledged never to use again. The war had been won. The toy had proved its worth. But the world that followed had little appetite for the methods that had delivered the victory. So what does the story of the tornado at Desert Storm finally tell us about Britain's place in the world? It tells us, first, about a certain national character that has run like a thread through this country's military history: the willingness to take on the most dangerous job in the room. When the coalition needed someone to fly down the throat of the most heavily defended airfields in Iraq at rooftop height, in the dark, into a wall of fire, it was the Royal Air Force that flew the mission. Not because anyone forced them to, but because Britain's armed forces have long understood that a seat at the top table is purchased with risk, and that influence in a coalition is earned at the sharp end. The Iraqis sneered at a European toy. The men who flew it knew exactly what it was capable of, and exactly what it would cost. It tells us, too, about the strange in-between moment Britain occupied in 1991. A nation pivoting from the long certainties of the Cold War into an uncertain new age, fighting its first major war of the post-Soviet world with weapons and doctrine built for a different conflict entirely. The Tornado was a Cold War aircraft sent to fight a desert war, and in that mismatch lies the whole story of British defence in the 1990s, a military designed for one world, scrambling to adapt to another. The improvisations of the Gulf, the cannibalized division, the resurrected buccaneers, the frantic mastery of new tactics under fire, were the growing pains of a nation learning, all over again, how to project power far from home. And it tells us something about courage and about cost. The images of John Peters and John Nichol, paraded broken on Iraqi television, remain among the most haunting British memories of that war. A reminder that behind every clinical briefing and every triumphant gun camera clip were men of flesh and blood, doing their duty and paying a fearful price for it. They came home. Others did not. The runways they cratered have long since been repaired. The JP2-33 lies in museums, and the Tornado itself has been retired from RAF service. But the questions raised over those few January nights, about how much risk is worth how much reward, about the price of being America's most willing partner, about what kind of military Britain ought to be, those questions never really went away. The European toy proved its critics wrong in the most emphatic fashion. But it did so at a cost that Whitehall, and the families of the men who flew, would never forget. What do you make of it all? Was the RAF right to fly those punishing low-level missions, or was the price in aircraft and crews simply too high for the result? Was the Gulf War the moment Britain found its post-Cold War role, or the moment it bound itself too tightly to American adventures it would later regret? I'd genuinely like to hear your view, so drop a comment below and let's get the debate going. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Britain's part in Desert Storm, do hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the cockpits, the war rooms, and the corridors of power that shaped modern Britain. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.